In the beginning, he was Rome's hope. The empire had been teetering on the edge of ruin. Barbarian raids pressed on the frontiers, corruption rotted the Senate, and the common people cried for stability. Into this storm stepped a man hailed as a reformer, a soldier of iron discipline who promised to restore Rome's greatness. His victories on the battlefield gave him credibility, and his reforms in the city earned him the people's cheers. Grain was distributed, order was restored, and whispers called him the new savior of Rome. But power is a poison that seeps slowly, and in the shadows of his triumphs, paranoia took root. The very Senate that once crowned him with praise began to look like a nest of vipers in his eyes. Every smile seemed false, every compliment a mask for treachery. And so, one by one, his friends began to vanish. Senators who had dined at his table, generals who had fought beside him, even allies who had once carried his banner, all found themselves dragged into dark chambers, accused of conspiracy. Trials became a formality. Guilt was assumed, confessions extracted with cruelty. Executions became spectacles, not of justice, but of warning. The man who had promised stability brought instead a reign of terror, where no one was safe from suspicion. Mothers wept as their sons were taken. Fathers whispered in fear, afraid even to mention his name too loudly in their homes. The people who once hailed him as savior now looked over their shoulders in dread. Rome had been rescued, yes, but at a terrible cost. The emperor built walls not only around the city but around himself, barricading his heart against imagined traitors. He trusted no one, not his generals, not his advisors, not even his family. And yet, the cruelest irony was this. The conspiracies he feared most had not truly existed at first. It was his own paranoia, his endless purges, that gave birth to them. Every senator stripped of power, every ally betrayed, left behind grieving families, furious partisans, and desperate survivors plotting revenge. By trying to suffocate treason before it breathed, he created the very enemies he feared. In the end, he was no longer the reformer, nor the hero the people had once adored. He was a butcher, surrounded by shadows, his empire drenched in blood. His fall did not come from an invading army, nor a rival claimant. It came from within, born of the conspiracies that had once lived only in his mind. The savior of Rome became its terror, trapped in the iron cage of his own suspicions. And when his reign ended, Rome was not healed, but scarred, setting the stage for the next ruthless ruler to seize the throne. The Senate chamber had once been a place of dignity, where marble columns and golden statues reflected the grandeur of the republic long gone. But under this emperor it became a stage, an altar to his own divinity. He entered not as a man of flesh and bone, but as a god incarnate. Draped in shimmering robes of gold and purple, he demanded not respect but worship. Senators, the heirs of centuries of Roman power, were forced to bow low, their foreheads nearly scraping the marble floors. "I am not your equal," he declared, his voice echoing in the chamber like thunder. "I am your Jupiter." It was not metaphor. He believed it. And worse, he made others believe it too, if only to survive. To refuse was death, to hesitate was treason. Statues of gods were remade with his face, temples rededicated in his name. Rome, the city of 1,000 shrines, now had only one deity, the emperor himself. But worship was not enough. He needed humiliation. He turned the Colosseum into his grand stage, not for entertainment but for domination. Nobles, senators, even the wealthiest citizens, who had once scoffed at emperors, were forced into the arena. They were not spectators. They were actors in his grotesque theater, thrown to beasts, or ordered to duel as the crowd roared under his watchful eyes. One story whispered in Rome told of a senator too slow to kneel. The emperor ordered him dressed as a slave and paraded before the mob, only to have him torn apart by lions. Another night he declared the moon his bride, ordering a lavish wedding ceremony complete with vows and sacrifices before the bewildered gods and horrified men. To the outside world, these were the acts of a madman. But there was a darker truth. It was all calculated. Every humiliation was a blade, cutting away the pride of Rome's elite. Every display of divinity was a chain, binding the Senate and the people to his will. Fear grew with every decree. The nobles whispered of his madness, yet not one dared move against him. For who could oppose a god? Who could conspire when every guard, every priest, every citizen feared the emperor's gaze as if it were lightning from Olympus? But his divinity carried a curse. Gods do not live among men for long. His endless demand for worship bred resentment too deep to contain. His court, once filled with flatterers, became a nest of daggers. And though he sat on the throne of Jupiter, his end would come not from thunder above, but from shadows below. The emperor who declared himself a god would learn the most human truth of all: even gods can bleed. The boy emperor was little more than a child when the laurel crown was set upon his head. Too young to rule, too untested to command, he was a pawn in a game far older and far more ruthless than himself. At his side stood his mother, a woman of staggering ambition and sharper cunning than any senator or general. Where he was inexperienced, she was calculating. Where he hesitated, she whispered. Her voice became his law, her will his decree. The court quickly understood. To please the emperor, one need only please his mother. She held audiences, signed decrees, and even arranged foreign policy. Ambassadors bowed to her before they spoke to him. Behind the silk curtains of the palace, she shaped him like a sculptor chiseling marble, molding him into her perfect puppet. At first, he did not resist. Perhaps he even admired her strength, for she had secured his place on the throne and shielded him from rivals. But power has its own poison, and as the boy grew into a man, the chains of her control began to chafe. Whispers in the corridors of the palace told him what he already knew but could scarcely admit. Rome did not see him as emperor. Rome saw him as his mother's son. Her dominance was suffocating. She chose his advisors, dismissed his favorites, even meddled in his private life, selecting lovers for him like prizes at a feast. When he dared to speak of independence, she laughed, reminding him that without her, he would never have been more than a forgotten child in the shadows of the empire. But ambition, once lit, cannot be extinguished. The boy emperor began to plot, quietly, secretly, beneath her gaze. His smile remained obedient, his nods submissive, yet behind his eyes burned a fury she could not see. He courted allies in whispers, promising rewards for loyalty once her grip was broken. He entertained his mother with feigned respect, even as he plotted her destruction. The moment came with chilling precision. She was invited aboard a splendidly adorned ship, a gift from her ever-dutiful son. She smiled, believing it to be a token of devotion. But when the vessel left the shore, its true design was revealed. The ship was built not to carry her across the sea, but to collapse beneath her. As the hull splintered, chaos erupted, and she was thrown into the dark waters. Yet fate played cruel tricks. She survived the wreck, swimming to shore, demanding audience with the son she had created. It was then, in one final act of betrayal, that he sent soldiers to finish the work. The woman who had ruled Rome through him fell at his command, cut down not by rivals, not by strangers, but by the very child she had placed upon the throne. The boy had become emperor at last, but in seizing his freedom, he had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Rome was stunned, the empire whispered, and the shadow of his mother's death would follow him forever, a stain on his reign, and the first sign that the puppet had become a monster in his own right. Rome had seen eccentric emperors before, but none quite like him. At first glance, he was charming, young, handsome, a man who loved the games, the festivals, and the people's cheers. He promised not only victories on the battlefield, but also grand spectacles that would remind Rome of its glory. For a time, the empire indulged him, but soon, beneath the pageantry, a dangerous madness began to surface. The emperor believed himself a conqueror unlike any other. While others fought men, he declared war on the elements themselves. His grandest campaign was not against Parthia or Germania, but against Neptune, god of the sea. To his legions, hardened soldiers who had fought and bled across the empire, he gave a shocking order: prepare for battle against the waves. The soldiers, disciplined and loyal, obeyed, though confusion rippled through the ranks. On the shores of Gaul, he drew up his men in formation, swords drawn, shields raised. Trumpets blared, and with a dramatic sweep of his arm, he commanded the charge. "Strike down the sea! Claim victory for Rome!" The soldiers waded into the surf, thrusting their swords into foam and spray. Spears were hurled into the waves as if piercing an invisible enemy, and when the tide receded, the emperor declared triumph. Seashells, collected hastily by bewildered men, were paraded before him as trophies, the spoils of Neptune. Word of this spectacle spread like wildfire. Some laughed in disbelief. Others trembled, for his madness did not end at the shore. What had begun as a parody of war soon turned to cruelty. Entire cohorts were punished for imagined cowardice in this farce of a battle. Centurions were executed for failing to kill enough enemies. And yet, the most terrifying aspect was not his insanity, but its unpredictability. His whims ruled Rome. One day he might declare a holiday of feasting and games. The next he might order executions for minor offenses. Nobles dared not laugh at his absurdities, for jest could mean death. Generals who questioned his orders were branded traitors. The Senate, powerless and humiliated, played along with his delusions, applauding victories over gods they knew could not be defeated. Behind palace walls, conspiracies brewed. The emperor's mock war against the sea was more than a joke. It was a sign that Rome's destiny was chained to a madman's will. Every noble who bowed, every soldier who stabbed the waves did so with a bitter truth gnawing at their hearts. A man who waged war against Neptune could turn his fury on anyone. And so the empire braced itself, trapped under the rule of a general whose battles were not against men, but against the sanity of Rome itself. By daylight, he was every inch the emperor, stern, cold, and unyielding. Draped in purple robes, seated upon his golden throne, he carried the image of Roman authority. Courtiers bowed, generals saluted, and the Senate trembled in his presence. His decrees were sharp as a blade, his justice absolute. But when the sun fell and shadows spread across Rome, he shed his crown and purple. Disguised in rags, a hood over his head, he became something far more terrifying than a ruler. He became a hunter. The people of Rome whispered of strange figures in the night, gangs of masked men prowling the alleys, assaulting the unsuspecting, vanishing before dawn. What they did not know was that at the center of this terror was none other than the emperor himself. He reveled in the thrill of disguise, slipping into the labyrinth of Rome's streets with a band of loyal guards who shared in his dangerous games. They attacked taverns, broke into homes, and ambushed ordinary citizens returning from the markets. Women screamed, men begged for mercy, but their assailant laughed. For him, it was not cruelty alone. It was sport. To feel the rush of power in the dark, to see fear in the eyes of his own people when they did not know their tormentor was their emperor, this intoxicated him more than wine or glory ever could. By day, he would hear the complaints of the citizens about the mysterious gangs of night. He sat on the throne, feigning outrage, promising justice, while inside he was amused. He was judge and criminal, protector and predator. But his games carried a darker twist. He would sometimes reveal his identity to his victims at the very last moment, tearing back his hood to expose his face. For many, it was the final sight they ever saw. The message was clear. The emperor's power was absolute, in daylight and in shadow. There was nowhere to hide, no safety in the streets, no peace even in one's own home. Terror spread. Citizens locked their doors at sunset, praying they would not hear footsteps in the dark. The empire became a city under siege, not by foreign enemies, but by its own ruler. Yet even his guards whispered in fear. Madness cloaked in disguise was dangerous, but this was something worse. He was not insane in these nightly hunts. He was deliberate, methodical, savoring every moment. It was not the act of a deranged man, but of one who knew exactly what he was doing. Rome had always feared its emperors, but now it feared the night itself. And as his reign stretched on, the line between emperor and monster blurred until the people could no longer tell the difference. The city of Rome had never witnessed a celebration quite like this. Streets were draped in crimson and gold, fountains flowed with wine, and music filled the air with a hypnotic, almost sinister rhythm. The emperor had announced a grand wedding to unite the empire's most powerful families. It was to be a spectacle of love, of alliances, of splendor. Nobles traveled from far and wide, dressed in silks and jewels, eager to witness the grandeur and to curry favor with the throne. Yet beneath the glittering facade lay a more lethal design. The emperor, known for his cunning as well as his cruelty, had no intention of merely celebrating love. This was a trap. Every rival, every senator whose loyalty wavered, every noble who whispered behind closed doors, each had been invited under the guise of friendship. Each would soon discover that the Feast of Roses was also a feast of death. The ceremony itself was breathtaking. The bride, radiant and obedient, descended the steps of the palace adorned with gold, pearls, and the symbols of Rome. Music swelled, and the emperor himself presided over the union, smiling with calculated warmth. Guests whispered about the political brilliance of the match, unaware that the emperor's hand guided more than just the marital vows. As the banquet began, the first signs of betrayal emerged. Servants slipped poison into goblets meant for select nobles. Secret signals from the emperor's loyal guards released hidden blades in the shadows, striking those deemed disloyal. Laughter mingled with screams as the unsuspecting aristocracy realized too late that they were the prey, and the emperor's smile only widened. The twist came when it was revealed why the bride had been chosen. She was the widow of one of his most feared enemies, a man whose family had once threatened his reign. By marrying her, the emperor secured not only the alliance but also the submission of a household that had opposed him for generations. Blood and scandal intertwined with politics, and the empire watched as power was cemented in the most dramatic, horrifying way possible. Guests who survived the initial slaughter were left terrified, understanding that every toast, every dance, every smile could conceal a dagger. Fear and loyalty became inseparable, bound together by the memory of the night. Rome would talk for years about the wedding that was more massacre than celebration, a testament to the emperor's ingenuity, ruthlessness, and flair for dramatic cruelty. By the time the last candle flickered and the guests fled, the emperor had achieved more than union. He had cemented fear as the empire's true law. And in the halls of the palace, where blood mingled with wine, he raised his cup in a silent toast to power itself, unchallenged and absolute. Trust was a luxury he never afforded. Even as emperor, he looked upon smiles and bows with suspicion, seeing in every gesture the glint of betrayal. His court, glittering with riches and ambition, was a theater of death, where every cup of wine, every bite of bread, could become a weapon. For the poisoned prince, suspicion was not madness. It was art. He began his reign quietly, cultivating an image of refinement and charm. Diplomats and senators praised his wit, generals admired his discipline, and the people adored his apparent generosity. Yet behind the gilded doors of the palace, the empire's court had already been transformed into a labyrinth of poison and plots. Attendants were trained to offer cups with careful hands, wine goblets were examined thrice before being presented, and fruits were cut by trusted eunuchs. Even so, no one was truly safe, for the emperor's paranoia had sharpened into obsession. It started with whispers. A rival general who had dared to question orders fell mysteriously ill. The court suspected foul play, but no one could prove it. A senator's sudden collapse was explained away as a heart attack, though the servants knew the truth. Slowly, a reputation grew. The emperor's enemies did not merely die. They disappeared quietly, leaving the palace steeped in fear and uncertainty. Family was no shield. Wives and siblings, children and cousins, none escaped scrutiny. Every banquet was a test, every dinner a trial. The emperor would watch closely, his eyes scanning for nervous glances, hands twitching or hesitation in speech. He would smile, offer the poisoned cup himself, and withdraw gracefully, leaving victims to their fates. Some survived, some did not. Those who did spoke in hushed tones of the emperor's meticulous cruelty. Yet the most haunting twist of his rule was poetic. His own demise mirrored his methods. Years of mastery over venoms and toxins did not save him from betrayal. One evening, in a quiet moment of complacency, he drank from a cup tainted not by himself, but by someone he had trusted. His own paranoia had blinded him to the subtle plots of others. The poisoned prince, who had claimed countless lives through cunning and calculation, met his end in the same manner he had inflicted on so many, silently, invisibly, with the betrayal of trust. Rome trembled at the news, not only at his death, but at the lesson it imparted. No matter how clever, no matter how ruthless, even an emperor could fall. And in the shadows of the palace, those who survived learned that the empire's true danger was not only in the weapons or armies, but in the ever-present poison of power itself. The poison prince's reign left behind a court of suspicion and fear, a kingdom where even victory tasted bitter, and the lesson of trust, or the lack thereof, would echo through Rome for decades to come. Rome had long celebrated the spectacle of blood in the arena, where gladiators fought, beasts tore, and the crowd roared in fevered excitement. But this emperor transformed the Colosseum into something far darker, an extension of his own will, a stage upon which he proved that the law of survival belonged solely to him. He did not merely preside over the games, he participated. Dressed in armor that gleamed like the sun, he entered the arena as both judge and executioner. Senators who had once advised him bowed in fear as he strode past, knowing that any hesitation could mean death. Slaves and criminals became unwilling partners in his grotesque performance, their screams echoing against the stone walls as he dispatched them with calculated precision. The crowd, at first stunned, soon roared with a mixture of horror and awe. Some cheered, thinking it part of the show. Others trembled, understanding that they were witnessing a ruler whose hunger for dominance extended beyond politics, beyond military conquest. It was a hunger for validation, for proof that even gods of man could be humbled by one emperor's might. But the emperor's bloodlust was not mere vanity. Each act in the arena was a message. The aristocracy watched helplessly as the strong and defiant were crushed before their eyes. Every clash of sword and roar of beasts reinforced the emperor's supremacy. To challenge him was to step into the arena, and stepping in meant certain death. Even generals feared to command without his approval, for their soldiers had seen their commanders slain before the roar of the people. Families whispered in fear as their sons were sent to train as gladiators, knowing that the emperor's whim could send them to the sands at any moment. It was an empire ruled not only by law but by spectacle, by terror, and by the chilling thrill of public execution. Yet beneath the spectacle was a darker obsession. The emperor sought not merely to demonstrate power, but to feel it coursing through his veins. Every scream, every clash of steel, every death brought him a perverse satisfaction. It was as if he measured Rome's strength by how it reacted to his cruelty, and in turn, measured his own humanity by the absence of it. When the games ended, the arena itself seemed stained with more than blood. It bore the mark of a ruler who had blurred the lines between sport, war, and murder. Rome had cheered, but the city shivered, knowing that the emperor's obsession with power would stop at nothing. For him, survival was not just about the empire. It was about proving that he, above all, was the ultimate predator. And in the shadows of the Colosseum, those who had survived whispered, terrified that no one was safe, least of all themselves. The night air was thick with smoke, and the city of Rome trembled beneath a crimson sky. Flames licked the marble and timber of once proud buildings, devouring temples, markets, and homes with a ferocity no soldier could halt. Citizens fled in terror, carrying what little they could salvage, their screams blending with the roar of the fire. And at the center of it all, the emperor stood, or at least so the rumors said, watching, smiling, and playing his lyre as if orchestrating a symphony of destruction. Whether he had struck the match or not remained a mystery, but his presence was undeniable. From the balconies of his palace, he surveyed the chaos like a conductor, reveling in the spectacle of a city ablaze. Smoke twisted into the sky like ghostly fingers, and every corner of Rome seemed to writhe beneath his gaze. Soldiers attempted to combat the inferno, but they were no match for either the flames or the fear that gripped them. Whispers spread quickly through the terrified populace. Some claimed the emperor himself had set the fire, angry at the Senate or jealous of some minor affront. Others said it was punishment for the people's disloyalty, a demonstration of the empire's fragility under his hand. No one knew the truth, but all understood the lesson. The emperor's power could manifest as both creation and annihilation, and none could escape either. Yet, the most terrifying aspect of the fire was not its destruction, but the emperor's cunning. While the city burned, he had already begun to shape the ashes into a new Rome. Streets were realigned, temples rebuilt in his honor, and new monuments erected to glorify his reign. Out of catastrophe, he constructed a vision of control so complete it left survivors in awe and terror alike. Even those who had once whispered of rebellion found themselves kneeling before the emperor's carefully crafted restoration. In the crowded forums, citizens debated in hushed tones, arguing whether he was a monster or a visionary. The fire had leveled homes, businesses, and lives, yet it also elevated his status, proving that Rome's fate was inseparable from the whims of its ruler. The flames were both punishment and proclamation. The emperor was absolute, untouchable, and unstoppable. Some nights later, survivors swore they saw him wandering the charred streets, inspecting his work with a detached eye. He did not grieve. He did not rage. He simply observed, calculating the next step in a city rebuilt from fear. Rome had burned, and in its ashes rose a ruler whose artistry lay in terror, whose genius was cruelty, and whose ambition knew no bounds. The empire's arsonist had shown the world the price of unchecked power, and the city would remember it for centuries to come. Among all the emperors of Rome, none inspired fear with so little display of blood or chaos. He did not roar in the arena, hunt his citizens at night, or set cities aflame. His power was quieter, colder, and infinitely more terrifying. While others wielded brute force, he ruled with calculation, patience, and the precision of a master chess player. Every law, every decree, every alliance was a move in a game no one else understood, and one in which all players, sooner or later, lost. From the moment he ascended the throne, he observed, generals, senators, and even his own family were examined for weaknesses, for ambitions, for cracks in loyalty. Smiles were measured, gestures recorded, words parsed for hidden meaning. To oppose him was not merely dangerous, it was futile, because he anticipated every action before it occurred. What others saw as governance was, in reality, a carefully choreographed dance of power and submission. He never raised a hand in anger. He never needed to. Wars were fought on paper, through manipulation and subtle coercion. Rivals were removed not by spectacle, but by invisible hands. Poisoned alliances, whispered rumors, legal technicalities that discredited entire families. His enemies often did not realize they were defeated until it was too late, leaving Rome in awe of a ruler whose ruthlessness was measured in silence rather than in screams. Even reforms, praised by historians for strengthening the empire, were part of the strategy. Laws that seemed to protect citizens subtly curtailed their freedom. Infrastructure projects, while glorified as public works, bound provinces more tightly to imperial control. Every act of benevolence concealed a hidden purpose, a way to extend dominion without provoking rebellion. In this way, he cloaked cruelty in civility and oppression in order. Perhaps the greatest fear he inspired was not the immediacy of death or spectacle, but the inevitability of his logic. Even after his passing, the structures he built, both political and psychological, remained. Generations of senators, generals, and citizens learned to bend before the machinery he left behind, recognizing the genius of a man who had mastered the art of absolute control. And yet, there was no bloodlust, no public display of terror, no madness in his eyes. He ruled like winter itself, cold, relentless, and impossible to escape. His empire endured not because it was flamboyant or feared for its spectacles, but because it had been engineered to survive, unyielding, calculated, and eternal. In the shadow of this cold strategist, Rome learned the most terrifying truth of all. The deadliest emperor was not always the one who struck loudly, but the one who struck invisibly, shaping an empire through cunning, patience, and a mind that never rested. And in that silence, his legacy outlived the chaos of all who had come before him.